was 1836 and chronic illness had compelled the young Dorothea Lynn Dix to close her last school for good. 15 years after she began teaching underprivileged kids in her grandmother's house in Boston, she would begin an era of social change that impacted an important turning point in American history. Change in the 1800s was not uncommon. Both the 19th and 20th century saw rapid social, economic, and technological changes. In the 1800s alone, the young America was experiencing movements in civil rights, temperance, and industry. Each one of these were a turning point in their own right, but mental health especially is amongst the most significant yet forgotten events in American history. When Dix returned to her break in Europe, she brought the mental health movement back with her to America. Towards the end of the 1700s, reformers such as Felipe Pinel were already pushing this turning point. In 1792, he became the chief physician at the Paris Asylum for Men, boldly unchaining patients who may have worn the shackles for anywhere up to 30 years, oftentimes the majority of their lifetimes. He, like many others, refuted the idea of mental illness as a result of demonic possession. A lack of knowledge about the brain and body led to a belief that insanity was a result of evil spirits or witchcraft, an idea that persisted well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Like others at the time, Dix wished
to call to attention the present state of insane persons confined within the Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience.
Even supposed asylums often were underfunded, underkept, and overcrowded. Without a means of proper funding, these were either sponsored by individuals and charities or, occasionally, local government. It's impossible to know how many of the mentally ill resided in these asylums, but given that 1 in every modern-day American suffers from some form of diagnosable mental illness, it's safe to say that many people were not getting the care they needed. Some lived with their families. Others, who could not afford treatments, found themselves housed in dismal prisons and unsanitary almshouses. Things were looking grim. Although every individual is subject to the Eighth Amendment, which rules against cruel and unusual punishment, this entitlement was often forgotten by such institutions. Men and women condemned to early caricatures of asylums found themselves stripped of humanity. Voltaire, a French Enlightenment philosopher, wrote in 1764 that
madness is the worst of all diseases, because it deprives the man of his reason, without which he cannot be a man.
In June of 1844, the American Journal of Psychology was first published. 3 years after Dix first found herself in the East Cambridge jail in Massachusetts, teaching Sunday school to female inmates. This job allowed her to witness how badly the prisoners were treated by the staff, especially in the case of a mental illness. In her book, Remarks on Prisons and Prison Discipline in the United States, she recounted how
the insane are exposed to every species of abuse, neglect, and insult. They are often confined in damp, dark, and cold cells where they are deprived of every comfort and even of the necessities of life. They are frequently chained to the floor, or the wall, or their bedsteads, and sometimes with iron collars around their necks. They are whipped, beaten, and tortured in various ways by their brutal keepers, who seem to take a diabolical pleasure in inflicting pain and misery on their hopeless victims.
This work highlighted the abuse perpetrated in the prisons. It helped to raise awareness on the treatment of criminals and inmates. Overcrowded, unsanitary prisons were a problem that didn't just concern the mentally ill. Contrary to some other reformers at the time, Dix worked mainly to appeal to the powerful and to the public. In her dedication to free those in prison for the crime of being unwell, Dix helped to improve the conditions for other inmates as well. For example, her memorial to the legislature of Massachusetts, published in 1843, requested the state help fund and maintain mental hospitals, bringing not only recognition to the cause, but also leading the government to set aside funding to improve care for the mentally ill. While Harriet Tubman was running her famed Underground Railroad, taking Southern slaves to freedom, Dix continued to tour prisons and asylums in the United States, including New Jersey, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. In 1854, she led the campaign for a bill for the indigent insane, which suggested setting land approved for those who struggle with blindness, deafness, and learning disabilities. Although passed by Congress, President Franklin Pierce vetoed this law on the grounds that social welfare was a responsibility of the states, and not the nation. Federalist practices present at the time made it unclear whether care of the people was the responsibility of national or state governments. Regardless, this veto was significant, as it meant that any reformer would now have to win over states individually in order to accomplish funding and land grants. But Dix would not give up. Instead, she persisted. The first half of the 1800s can be summed up in the words of the American author Ralph Waldo Emerson.
What is man made for but to be a reformer, a remake of what man has made?
Fast forward to the spring of 1861. The Alabama Insane Hospital, later renamed Bryce Hospital, received its first patient, diagnosed with mania. As a result of political excitement, a week later, civil war spread across the nation. The Reconstruction era began the healing process of the nation, accompanied with an expansive kindling that fueled a turning point in mental health care. Silas Ware Mitchell, a notable surgeon who worked during the Civil War, took an interest in nervous diseases and became known for a variety of breakthroughs discovered through his work, most notably his rest cure. Although they had no names for such things yet, Mitchell treated patients with diseases such as anorexia, depression, anxiety, and likely PTSD. Evidently, the 19th century was not want for reform. However, Dix was one of the most influential reformers at the time and remains relevant today. She nearly single-handedly made it her life's mission to establish more than 32 institutions in the United States, and she worked tirelessly in order to have her voice and the voice of the insane, the practically voiceless, heard. Her work helped to get a previously disregarded field of psychology better recognized amongst the legislature and the public, helping to give us a better understanding of insanity and mental illness. These include antipsychotic and anti-anxiety drugs, commonly prescribed, as well as means such as therapy. The 1900s saw an interesting rise in treatments that included use of the electric chair and the popularization in lobotomies, neither of which are used today. Both had dire consequences, often immobilizing patients who may or may not have had a say in this decision. This included the sister of President John F. Kennedy, Rosemary, lobotomized at 23 years old at her father's entreaty. Dix's contributions led to a kaleidoscope of lasting changes. Recognizing mental illness opens up possibilities for treatments, which increases many people's quality of life. Dorothea Dix dedicated her life to a cause, pushing a turning point in history. Her work in mental hospitals and prisons is irreplaceable. And although she worked alongside many similar, like-minded reformers, it was ultimately her dedication that pushed for the establishment of at least 32 asylums in nearly half as many states. Through her efforts, she built a foundation for future generations, and her missions reminds us that while difficult, change is inevitable, and we must always be looking towards the future.